Hello and welcome. My name is Alan Pamphilon and I am the author of this walk. I hope you enjoy it. This virtual walk will take us on a trip back into the past to a time when Marconi was one of the biggest employers in Chelmsford. In those days, the most common way to travel around the town was by bicycle. This tour will take us from here in Hall Street to finish inside the Marconi factory in New Street. Back in the mid-1890s, Guglielmo Marconi was in his mid-20s, living in Italy near Bologna. He had a keen interest in the new science of wireless telegraph. He had read all the material on the subject he could find. With this knowledge he started to build equipment and experimented with sending basic Morse messages to his brother in the next village. He soon realised that this message system would be very useful to the Italian Navy, but when he approached them, they showed little interest. His Irish mother, Annie Jamieson, suggested that they should journey to London because at the time England was the world's premier maritime nation. In 1896 they arrived in London together with his equipment. William Priest was then the chief engineer of the General Post Office, and he saw great potential in this young Italian and his ideas. He assigned one of his key men, George Kemp, to work with Marconi. Kemp was a short man with red curly hair and a handlebar moustache. The two men got on well right from the start, and soon Kemp and Marconi developed a good working relationship. The GPO was then a very powerful organisation and could see a great future in the new wireless technology. By 1897, Marconi had developed a radio system to send long-distance messages. He ran successful experiments sending radio signals first across the Salisbury Plain and then the Bristol Channel. By then, he was travelling around the country demonstrating his new wireless equipment. The contacts he made on these trips generated some financial backing for Mr. Marconi, and later that year he was able to move away from William Priest and the support from the GPO. He formed Marconi's Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company Limited and took George Kemp with him. Kemp became a very close friend, and later in life he went on to advise Mr. Marconi even on such key things as the best diet. In December 1898, Mr. Marconi's advisors were looking for a property in this area, and they came across this old silk mill owned by Mr. W.G. Wenley and Son. Very soon they took out a lease for the old mill, which included Alfred's cottage next door. The length of the lease, 25 years. Alfred Cottage later became the residence of the on-site caretaker John Reeve. The old silk mill then became the first wireless factory in the world. Why choose Chelmsford? Well, the countryside around was mostly flat, and it was within easy reach of London by the railway. There was also the electrical industry of the great Colonel Crompton just up the road, and as well as that there was the industrial engineer Fell Christie. Another reason for coming here may have been that there was no tram network in Chelmsford, and so no aerial electrical interference. In 1898 at Hall Street, the layout of the new wireless factory was with a machine shop on the ground floor with an overhead belt system to drive the various drills and lathes. Upstairs was divided off into a number of rooms, including a research laboratory, and 3 rooms dedicated to the manufacture of electrical coils. Initially there were 20 men and 2 boys employed on the site, but this soon increased to roughly 55 people, split between men on the ground floor and women on the first floor. From 1900 onwards, small spark gap wireless sets were made here, mainly for the use at sea. Mr. Marconi was a great salesman, and after loaning 3 of these sets to the Royal Navy, they became one of his biggest customers. This prompted other ship owners to follow suit, including merchant ships. In 1903, radio equipment made at this factory helped Mr. Marconi to make the first transatlantic radio broadcast, when he sent a Morse code message signal from Cornwall to Newfoundland. This signal was the first step towards the commercial transatlantic wireless service of 1908. Research in those days was carried out at experimental stations at Poole Harbour and at Fell Christie's site in Broomfield, just north of Chelmsford. With the expansion of the business, manufacturing was in 1905 transferred to Dalston in East London. But things did not go well, and eventually, due to poor management, in 1908 was moved back to Hall Street. When Mr. Marconi took over as stand-in managing director, business was slow. However, in January 1910, he appointed a new man to join him as joint managing director. His name was Godfrey Isaacs. Once he was given complete control in August of that year, operations improved and production soon spread across Hall Street to a plot of land just opposite Alfred Cottage. There a 210-foot steel radio mast had been erected. Double-day shifts were then being worked in the factory to make wireless equipment to export all over the world. By then, all the great Atlantic liners had been fitted with radio sets: Lusitania, Mauretania, Baltic, Olympic and the ill-fated Titanic. To ensure these sets were operated correctly, Mr. Marconi insisted that as part of the lease of the radio equipment, only his trained operators were to use it. So all the radio operators at the time were employees of the Marconi Wireless Company. A complete radio system made in Hall Street was installed on the Titanic before she sailed on her maiden voyage across the Atlantic. The message system they used was called Marconigrams. It was a commercial venture and it was charged at 5 pence per word. On the night of 15th of April 1912, the RMS Titanic collided with an iceberg and eventually sank. There were 2 radio operators on board, Harold Bride and John Jack Phillips, both trained Marconi men. Jack was on duty at the time and he was soon joined by Harold. Together they continued to tap out the distress message even as the ship was going down. First they broadcast CQD and then, at the captain's suggestion, SOS. Both men made it off the boat, as it turned out, to the same upturned collapsible lifeboat, but only Harold, the junior officer, survived the extreme cold conditions. When he was rescued by the SS Carpathia, he was barely conscious, but when he came round, he asked to be taken to the ship's radio room. Even though he was then suffering from severe frostbite in his legs and feet, he continued with the other operator to send out broadcasts for another 18 hours. In June 1912, at the Court of Inquiry into the loss, the judge stated that those over 700 people who had been saved because of Mr. Marconi and his marvellous invention. Ironically, Marconi had been offered a free passage on Titanic before she sailed, but he had instead taken the Lusitania 3 days earlier. He had left from Liverpool to New York to attend an important business meeting involving the American side of the Marconi company. Eventually, in the summer of 1912, even more space was required, and so Godfrey Isaacs instigated the company's relocation to the New Street site. Research, however, continued in the huts across Hall Street under the tall mast, and 2 days before the outbreak of World War I, a man called Morris Wright was experimenting with a new device he had been working on. He picked up some long-distance German naval Morse radio signals, and these were passed to the British Admiralty. From this one incident, a whole network of secret listening Y stations grew up. This was open wireless traffic, and it was not until after the war that radio ciphers and codes were used for the first time. The old radio factory was used for research for some time, until 1923. It then reverted to its earlier use as a furniture store, but this time for Pickfords. More recently, it became the offices of the Essex Water Company. Today the building has been converted completely into apartments. However, it still bears 2 commemorative blue plaques, one for the wireless factory and the other for Sir Robert Telford, a past managing director of the Marconi company. We are now standing in Barrack Square, looking at a large black and white photograph that was taken sometime around 1916. In it we see the old Regent Cinema, built in 1913 as a theatre, but just 3 years later, in August 1916, it became a cinema with a seating capacity of over 1,000 people. It was also used by the Chelmsford Amateur and Operatic Society. This quite probably would have been the place where a number of Marconi employees would have spent their Saturday nights, at the Flicks. Beside the bridge was the Cock Inn, a square block building. This was demolished in around 1890 to make way for the Gothic style Wesleyan Methodist Church, whose foundation stone was laid in 1897. It had seating for around 800 people and had a large schoolroom at the back. In the 1950s it was realised that the great church was sinking into the river, and so it was eventually demolished. We have now moved up the High Street and are now standing next to the Saracen's Head Hotel, built around 1539 and then rebuilt in 1724. This was an old coaching inn, and the evidence is the carriage arch, which is still there today. Senior Guglielmo Marconi only stayed in the very best hotels, and he must have liked the Saracen's Head because this was his Chelmsford residence when visiting the factory in New Street. Mr. Marconi's association with this building has now prompted the installation of a special plaque which we can now see on the outside of the building. This was made possible by the hard work of the Chelmsford Civic Society. During the Second World War, the Saracen's Head opened its doors to the American Red Cross. This fact has prompted the new owner to rename the building the Garrison. Shire Hall. This was designed by John Johnson and built in 1791 using the same stone as the stone bridge, again with code stone decorations. In November 1900, an exhibition of Essex manufacturers took place in Shire Hall. In the ballroom, Mr. Marconi installed working, receiving and transmitting stations. During the exhibition, assistants were seen sending and receiving wireless messages. The visitors could then witness at first hand this intensely interesting new invention in action. We are now standing in front of the railway bridge in New Street. Right up until the 1950s, shift changes at the Marconi works resulted in massive congestion in around New Street. These were mainly bicycles with the occasional bus, even a few cars. The restriction of this traffic was the railway bridge, which was replaced with a wider structure in 1956. We are now standing in front of the Marconi New Street Works. The area to the right was once a goods yards with cattle pens and was part of the railway. This linked to the main line via a steep embankment. This siding originally served Marriage's flour mill and later the Hoffman Ball Bearing Company. When the New Street factory was built, the siding was extended across the road and into the factory. Evidence of the entrance to the goods yard opposite the end of the New Street building can be seen in old photographs taken in 1919. We are now about to enter the Marconi New Street building and will be passing through the large door, which is marked by an arch saying Marconi's over the door. We have now passed through the great door into the foyer of the New Street building, and away to our left we see the large staircase. I first saw this view back in 1986 when I came here for an interview for a position in the photographic department, which was then just at the top of these stairs. I did not get the job, but my details were passed on to another Marconi company who employed me for 24 years. In 1911 the company was expanding so fast that the Hall Street site was no longer big enough. Godfrey Isaacs, the then managing director, proposed the world's first purpose-designed and purpose-built wireless factory. Marconi and Isaacs' vision was for a manufacturing city which was completely self-sufficient, with raw materials coming in railway trucks across the road and right into the factory, and the finishing goods travelling out in the opposite direction. The town's former cricket ground in New Street, owned by the church, was purchased by the company in January 1912, and within an astounding 17 weeks, including 1 week for a strike, a huge workforce of 500 workers constructed the world's first purpose-built radio factory. The reason for the urgency in completing the factory was to coincide with an international radio conference to be held in London. This was a chance for Mr. Marconi to showcase his new factory to the world. On the 22nd of June 1912, the delegates were brought from London on a special train, and their tour of the new factory started just inside the large front door. To ensure the new employees had somewhere to live, housing was built in 2 nearby roads by the Marconi Company. These were given the names of Bishop Road and Marconi Road. The new site was some 70,000 square feet, whereas Hall Street was 4,000 square feet. To minimise the disruption, the entire move from Hall Street to the new site was carried out over a weekend. The main building at New Street housed the offices and showrooms of the site. Upstairs there was a drawing office at the far end, and at the other end was the senior management dining room. Up until World War II, the men and women workers were segregated with separate entrances to the site and even separate canteens. The only exception to this was that the women had male supervisors. One of the entrances was by a set of turnstiles at the railway bridge end of the building, and the other was at the opposite end where there was 2 large level crossing gates. This was where the railway trucks entered the site. Once on the site, the trucks were then turned at right angles on turntables and then pushed beside specially constructed platforms where they were unloaded and then reloaded with finished product. In 1912, the effect of the Titanic tragedy brought a drastic review of international marine safety. The outcome was a requirement that every ship of more than 16,000 tons was to be equipped with a radio room that could be manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All this extra business resulted in the Marconi Company in 1913 paying their first dividend to their shareholders. The outbreak of World War I brought a large demand on the company for both wireless and artillery range-finding equipment. There was also a high demand for trained radio operators. The company made the decision that their offices should be open both day and night to enrol and instruct these new recruits in the art of Morse code and wireless operation. In 1920, speech and entertainment over the wireless, or radio, was very much in its infancy. Some of the engineers based at New Street were keen to experiment with the new communication medium. As an experiment, they were permitted to carry out regular 30-minute broadcasts. The clever man responsible for these was Mr. W.T. Ditcham. Initially, these broadcasts were just speech, like reading railway timetables, and then the newspaper, which was greeted with much pleasure. This reaction started the engineers thinking of more uses of this new medium. They soon started playing gramophone records, and the equipment seemed to cope well, and so they moved on to the next step, live musical performances. At that time there was a young lady who was a part-time amateur soprano, and she was working in the offices at the nearby Hoffman Ball Bearing Company. Her name was Miss Winifred Sayer. One of the Marconi engineers, Edward Cooper, invited Winifred to come and sing for them into their wireless equipment. Because of this invitation, Winifred became Britain's first paid radio artiste. So in spring 1920, for 3 nights, she was paid the handsome nightly sum of 10 shillings, that's £20 in today's money, to sing for 30 minutes in a converted packing shed on the Marconi New Street site. The location was somewhere near Marconi Road. The acoustics in the shed were terrible, and the microphone equipment she was asked to sing into was made up of a part of a telephone receiver mouthpiece and a wood surround made from an old cigar box. To ensure the apparatus was at the correct height, it was tied with a string to a hat stand. This crude microphone was connected to a powerful transmitter which was humming away not far from her. In fact, you could see it glowing blue on the other side of the room. Outside, the transmitter cable was coupled to a long aerial wire suspended between 2 450-foot high masts. These at the time could be seen right the way across Chelmsford. There was no backing music, so she kept her songs short, with only a tuning fork to start her in the right key. After one of these sessions, she was told by Godfrey Isaacs that she had helped to make history. Winifred at the time was unimpressed, but later she was to learn that her voice could be heard as far away as Norway. In June 1920, a more famous broadcast was made by Dame Nellie Melba, using virtually the same equipment, but Winifred was first. However, history seems to have forgotten her and her great voice. However, the Chelmsford Civic Society are now working on the request for a blue plaque to honour this great woman and the part she played in radio history. Working with the Daily Mail newspaper, the Marconi Publicity Department arranged to persuade a famous Australian opera singer, Dame Nellie Melba, to come to Chelmsford and sing into the equipment tested by Winifred. The deal was finally sealed when a fee of £1,000 was offered. On the 15th of June 1920, Dame Nellie arrived on a special train from London and was brought to the New Street site. After a light meal, she was taken across the yard to a hastily prepared studio. When Dame Nellie Melba was informed by one of the technicians that her voice was going to emanate from those large masts, she was heard to say, "Young man, if you think I'm going all the way up there, you're very much mistaken." This event was the first official publicised sound broadcast in the UK. The result was a signal that could be heard as far away as Berlin and Madrid. How far did it go? Well, there was something picked up in Australia, but it was very difficult to hear it clearly through all the static. Through careful research, we have now managed to pinpoint the exact location of where that first radio studio was located. It's on the corner of Marconi Road and Dunside. Writtle. On February 14th, 1922, the world's first regular wireless broadcasts for entertainment began from the Marconi laboratories at Writtle, in an ex-army wooden hut on the edge of a field. Their call sign was 2 Emma Tock, 2MT. The leader of the small entertainment team was one Captain Peter Eckersley. Working in their own time, using modified company equipment, they broadcast for 30 minutes every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. To start with, the content of these broadcasts was fairly serious, with the team being given a gramophone and a number of long-playing records. Some of these they decided were too highbrow. When they ran out of records, Eckersley would have a go at singing himself, and he would be accompanied by an old piano that they had borrowed from the local pub and trundled down Lawford Lane. Was it in tune? Maybe not. In time, the content of these broadcasts got more outlandish, and including telling jokes, adding special sound effects, and doing impersonations. Apparently the broadcast sounded much like an early version of The Goon Show, but this was 30 years ahead of when they were finally heard. Where did all this talent finally get used? Well, most of the people involved directly with 2MT ended up working for the new British Broadcasting Corporation. Eckersley became their first chief engineer. The site where the old army hut stood is now the location of Melba Court in Writtle. The hut has been restored and can now be found at the Sanford Mill Museum. On open days, broadcasts are now made from the hut by the Chelmsford Amateur Radio Society. On the other side of Chelmsford, Little Waterhouse Farm was purchased by the Marconi Company in 1934. On that site, B Building started life as a storage garage for a fleet of Marconi radio vans. However, during World War II, it became the production facility for the new cavity magnetron, the heart of a secret high-power precision radar device codenamed H2S. This device could see over a distance of many miles. This proved very good in detection of enemy submarine periscopes, even in the dark. The magnetron device was developed first at Birmingham University in 1940, then later in a laboratory at the New Street site before being moved onto the Marconi site at Great Baddow, and then finally on to mass production at Waterhouse Lane. Tracking the German submarines was made possible by deciphering the naval Enigma communications, which were achieved by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Planes then armed with the new H2S radar were then dispatched to the locations, and these submarines were then neutralised where possible. During the war, a number of ladies worked at the New Street site. One of these was Florence Attridge, who worked on the supervision of coil winding, a key part of a covert radio set. For this work, after the war, she received a British Empire Medal and was also thanked by the head of Naval Intelligence. Did she have a secret World War II life? Another such lady was June Rosie Mason, who in 1941 started work in the Special Dispatch Department located in the Marconi Heritage Room on the New Street site. She stayed working there until her retirement some 46 years later. Sir Christopher Cockrell was an English engineer and an inventor of the hovercraft. He was born and educated in Cambridge and started working for the Marconi company in 1935. Whilst working for Marconi during World War II, he contributed to the development of radar systems, which he believed to be one of his greatest achievements. In 1950 he was involved in a patent for high brightness displays. During 1955 he tested his hovercraft theory using a hairdryer and 2 tin cans and found that the hypothesis to be true. He then made a prototype and tried it out in Robert Telford's bath in his house in Great Waltham. The idea was not an immediate success, and he was forced to sell many personal possessions in order to finance his research. 4 years later, in 1959, a prototype craft crossed the English Channel between Dover and Calais. In 1969, Christopher Cockrell was knighted for his services to engineering. Although the Marconi company has disappeared from Chelmsford, the legacy lives on the site of that World War II magnetron factory, which became known as the English Electric Valve Company, or EEV. Coming right up to date, the English Electric Valve Company is now called Teledyne E2V. A major part of the production now on the Waterhouse Lane site is high quality imaging and cameras. They still, however, make magnetrons, but nowadays they are also used in the treatment of cancer and are the key component in body scanners. The image devices made at Teledyne E2V have been installed in the Hubble telescope, the New Horizon probe, and the comet-chasing spacecraft Rosetta and Philae. Their next probe will be sent to Mars. In conclusion, when the young Mr. Marconi used radio waves for practical signalling without wires in 1896, he led us into the area of practical electronics, including not only radio, but television, radar, and space communications. It may be claimed that Marconi's choice of a disused warehouse in Hall Street to be the birthplace of the world's radio industry makes Chelmsford the starting point of the electronic age. Could it be that because of Mr. Marconi's many talents, we now have microprocessors, powerful computers, mobile communications and wireless networks? Therefore, we should be very proud of our Marconi heritage and celebrate it, especially the many people who worked for the Marconi company over the years. Thank you for being part of this walk and enjoying it with me, and I hope to see you again soon. This is Alan Pamphilon signing off, and thank you for watching.